Hey everyone, welcome to the first episode of the TechRally Spotlight. In this series, I'm going to be talking about tech, chatting with real developers, and asking them questions about what they're doing right now, how they got there, and just talk about their lives as a software developer. In this episode, I am talking to someone that I personally know pretty well, and she's a software developer based in New York City. She also attended the same coding bootcamp at school as me, Flatiron School. And without further ado, I welcome you, Sarah Rivas. Hey, Sarah, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Doing good, good. Sarah, so tell me, what do you do and how did you get into software development?
Yeah, so I'm a software engineer at Unitas. So I've been doing that for a little under 2 years now with the company. Prior to coming to Unitas, I was working at a cancer hospital as a manager. So I was working on clinical trials. And during one of the projects that I worked on creating a dashboard that helps like integrate patient information from different programs. And in that opportunity, I worked with developers and had a chance to be at meetings where they live coded. And I just was blown away. I thought it was really interesting and I asked more information. And then kind of on my own, I started looking through different resources, specifically for web development, because there are a lot of resources out there for that. And, as soon as I started that, my interest kind of intensified. I looked into joining a boot camp and then here I am now.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty similar story to a lot of different people where they just kind of first start off just researching on their own and kind of transitioning into a boot camp. How long were you like self-studying for until you decided that boot camp was the right path to go?
It's a good question. I was self-studying for several months, kind of trying to balance, my full-time job and studying. But once I really picked up and kind of started building things on my own, I wanted to learn at a faster pace, and that's when I started looking into boot camps and trying to figure out like how I can kind of really learn faster and make this a career.
Yeah, that definitely it's like I guess they say that's why they call it a boot camp because you spend 3 months trying to be a software developer. How did you decide to choose Flatiron School and not and some I know there are a lot of different options out there now with like App Academy, Full Stack, things like that. What made you to go to Flatiron School?
Yeah, it was tough. I went to several open houses for the boot camps for the ones in New York City, because that's where I'm based at, and that's where I wanted to stay and to eventually find a job. But I found that Flatiron had a really nice like collaborative environment. So a lot of the day was broken up between like lectures, individual work, and pairing. So there was a lot of like working to collaborate on labs in like groups of two or three, and I felt that was a little bit different from the other boot camps that were very much like focused on kind of individualized work. I felt that that balance helped me learn a lot between seeing how different people learn and kind of learning from one another, and also getting used to how what their actual work environment is in terms of like you're working with a group of developers, you're often pairing, you're often kind of working together, and I feel like that uh, environment like better prepared me for what I would eventually land on.
Right. Um, so did you do all that research before you joined Flatiron School? Like, did they tell you what that kind of work environment was going to be like?
Yeah, they had like tours that they would take you on around the class, and then there was a section where they had a Q&A. They would bring you into a room, explain kind of what the curriculum was about, and then people would ask questions. And during that time, they explained, that there would be pair programming, that there were projects that you would work on at the end of each module with one or two other people.
Got it, got it. And what was the application process like? Because I know when I did it, it was probably a few years before you, so I'm kind of like a dinosaur in terms of Flatiron years. But for you and like how you got in, like what was the experience like? Did you have to take a coding test? Was there multiple interviews? What was it like to get into these coding boot camps? Because I always hear about some schools, they want you to be a developer before you even get to the coding boot camp school. So I know experience levels is pretty important to get into these coding boot camps.
Yeah. So I think by the time that I was ready to kind of commit, I had done some, work on my own, like online. But in order to actually, once I decided on Flatiron, what you do is like there's a boot camp prep course that you would take, which involves like a series of labs that you do on your own. I forget how long the time frame for that was, but maybe it was about 90 minutes. I don't entirely remember that part, but so it was, you would finish those labs, and that would be in preparation for the interview for Flatiron. And then, once you have that interview scheduled, you'd kind of, discuss like the work that you did, and they would ask like a series of questions, and then that would determine whether you get into the course.
So is it just one interview and then they'll determine if you get in or not, kind of thing?
Yes, the boot camp prep. So you have to complete all of it, and then the interview.
Got it. Got it. So once you got in and you started working as a Flatiron student, what was the general structure like? What was your day to day? Was it week by week? I know it's definitely changed a lot since I did it because there are like modules now and you still have to do your own personal projects. Like how do they balance it all out and what's the general curriculum like?
Yeah, so the general curriculum, it's 15 weeks total. There are exactly like 4 different types of like modules within those 15 weeks, and the last 3 weeks is your individual project. So leading up to the individual project, when you're working through these modules, one is specifically based on like programming fundamentals, like object-oriented programming. The second one is focused on like Ruby on Rails. And then you go into JavaScript and then React. And so during each of those on a daily basis, you have like lectures followed by labs where you either work on them individually, or there were certain days where you would work on with a group on certain labs. So after those 2 weeks, kind of the first 2 weeks of each module, you'd have a coding challenge where it would kind of encompass everything that you learn in those 2 weeks. And then, if you pass, that's great. If you don't pass that one, you have to retake it. And then when kind of after, if you pass, then you go on to kind of work on the project, which is that you work with another person to complete a project, specifically on on the language or framework that you cover in that module.
So how many projects do you end up with when you finish the whole boot camp?
So it would be 4. So it would be 4 projects that you'd have that you'd work with someone, and then the final project is the project that you worked on individually, and that's like the final project.
Got it, got it. So, but when you're showcasing your portfolio, do people generally show all 5 projects, or is it your individual project and maybe one other like group project?
Yeah, I think the main showcase is like your individual project, because that just like kind of shows, it brings together everything that you learned in terms of like you create the back end and front end for something. But I think that a lot of people do include the other projects because it shows kind of the development that you went through, and also your ability to collaborate with other people and projects.
Did you feel like finishing each module prepared you to actually build something from scratch, or was there some kind of direction that the curriculum was like, hey, you should try building this kind of project, or did you just more or less think about it yourself and apply the fundamentals that you learned from your module?
That's a good question. I think that so it prepares you to kind of build something like from scratch for that specific module, but each time for each module it builds, and that's like the culmination of that is that final project, because you can create a database for something, which we
I
learned in
see.
the first module for programming fundamentals. Then you have that back end, and then you have like the React layering on the front end where you can like make your website like pretty, and so like now you've gotten to a point where now you can build everything, but like before that it's like learning how to prepare each piece.
Right, right. That makes sense. And how fast do you think these modules were? Like, did you feel very like pressured or under the gun? I mean, 3 months is a short time for any kind of coding bootcamp school, but what was your sense and feel of like the curriculum speed and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely very challenging. It was very fast paced. The program flew by, I think, because of like,
Right.
the amount of work that you're kind of putting in. But I definitely felt that it was something that is manageable, and is something that at the end of it you realize like how far you come and how much like you actually learned, even though like as you're going from module to module you're like, do I still remember what I learned in the previous
Right.
module? Like now I have this knowledge from this module, like, but in some way, like it really is something that you retain, and that it just like coding, it's like it's more of like learning how to learn how to code, or sorry, learning like a new language. Like it's kind of like learning how you're going to learn that language versus like the actual language, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Sometimes it feels like you're learning such disconnected things, but then all of a sudden you just hit that like epiphany of like, oh, so this is how this works with this. And then you're like, oh, so I get it now exactly why I'm learning module one and how it connects to module two and module three. And then I guess it just culminates into that final project that you kind of showcase, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
I see. Cool. And how many hours per week do you think you were actually like studying, coding, attending class? Like obviously the school is from, I assume, like 9 to 5,
Mhm.
but I think people just think that you're going to be working from 9 to 5. It's obvious that's obviously not true, right? You're going to be like
That's
working after school ends and things like that.
exactly. Yeah, that's not true at all. It's 9 to 5 for pretty much what you know, for the lecture classes and curriculum. But after that, you know, after 6, you're pretty much working on your projects, homework assignments, things that you need to recap from the day, that you want to retain, something that you didn't fully understand. Now is the opportunity to look into it for yourself. So it's pretty much so I did it like in June through the summer, and that's pretty much like all I did that summer, is just really focus on getting that and
Yeah,
understanding.
yeah, I was joking with my friends. I mean, those 3 months I went to Coding Boot Camp School, I literally had no friends except my classmates because all I was doing was studying from Monday to Sunday, Monday to Sunday, back and forth. So it was just nonstop studying.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really good thing to point out because people just think that attending a coding bootcamp school guarantees you a job, but that's not true at all. Like you have to put in the work, and just trying to blaze through these modules isn't going to really get you a job. It's really what you retain and what you remember and learn how to do. So I think that's an important thing to note as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really good point. And you see that, you know, when you graduated, now you're going to kind of go in and have discussions about these things with potential employers, and it's like, you know, having that knowledge and having put in the work is going to equip you more to be able to do that.
Right. And what was your major again in college, you said?
It was in economics.
Right. And and there's a lot of people that think that you need to have some kind of like engineering degree or some kind of computer science degree to be successful at a coding bootcamp school. What would you say good percentage of people that attended the coding bootcamp? Was it pretty various different types of degrees or different types of professions, things like that?
Yeah, I feel like that's what's really interesting about software development. It's like people have different stories, and like they get there from different parts. I feel like there were some computer science majors in my class, in my you know, in the curriculum, but there were a few people that came from various arts backgrounds, English majors. It was very varied, and I think it just like, you know, if you're willing to put in the work and learn it and figure out like how to learn, then that's like gonna make you more successful.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, I think that's kind of the epitome of just like if you put in the hard work, then you'll see the outcome. And speaking of outcomes, what was it like after Flatiron School in terms of like trying to find a job? What was the interview process like? Did you feel ready? Things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of people like would argue that even like after graduating, there was, you know, it was like going straight to into more intense work where
Right.
now, you know, there's a lot of work that you need to do. There's a lot of network events that you go to. You're really working on your resume. You're not stopping coding. You're continuing to work on projects just so you can be, you know, that much more prepared. But definitely, yeah, I think it was definitely a very busy time filled with a lot of like meeting people and networking. And Flatiron also had a career fair, which is one that I attended that you know, kind of really have to prepare for. Um,
Yeah. So did you apply to any jobs yourself, or were a lot of the connections through the Flatiron Career Service team?
yeah, I ended up actually applying for several jobs on my own. But the job that I eventually, you know, landed on was through the career fair through Flatiron Services.
And is that something that they encourage you to do as well while you're like kind of getting connections? Because I remember when I did it, they were just like, "Don't worry about applying yet. Just focus on coding, and then we'll try to connect you to someone that might be an industry that you're interested in, kind of things like that." But I don't know if that's still the same feel as well.
Yeah. Throughout the module, like throughout while we were actually doing the coursework, they encouraged us just to focus on coding. But as soon as we finished, we were assigned with a career coach, and depending on where you were in the process and when you wanted to actually start, your job search. That's when they like recommended actually, starting to apply in certain areas. They also recommended certain companies that were hiring. They recommended certain events that would be good for, junior developers to attend. So it was definitely a mix of things that they
Right.
recommended.
And what was the interview process like? I know, obviously, I know our interview process, but you definitely were talking to a lot of different companies and things like that. What was the vibe that you got? Like, were they just expecting you to be like a 10x developer all of a sudden, or did some people were good, some people might have been not as good? Like, what was the general sentiment you thought?
Yeah, I think a lot of there were certain projects. I think as a junior developer coming out of a boot camp, I feel like there's a certain thing where you kind of need to, show that you have the skills. And I think one of those ways to kind of figure that out off the bat was through doing certain projects for different companies, and followed by the interview where you could at least talk about what you just built, and being able to kind of do that. Um, in a way that makes sense was what a lot of companies did. I felt that the expectations were in line with someone that was graduating from boot camp.
Got it. And how soon did you find a job after you graduated from boot camp?
After I graduated, I got the job about a month after.
And would you say that's considered average or a little faster than normal?
That's hard to say. I think there were some people in class that did it a little bit after that time frame. I think it was maybe a little bit sooner, perhaps. Um, yeah, I think it's probably on the sooner end.
I mean, obviously, you're a good developer, so you getting hired was not a problem for you. But at the first 3 months of working as a full time, once you accepted your job and working as a full time developer, I'm sure you're really excited and things like that. And in the first 3 months of working as a full time developer, what was that experience like? Was it kind of overwhelming? Was it like just there's just so much code? Or like, what was your general feeling about working full time as a software developer and getting paid?
Yeah, it was definitely, it was super exciting coming into, a new company, but then there were so many things to kind of, take in. And then that was a little bit overwhelming. So there was, the actual coding, that actually, you know, figuring out what the code base looked like, what were the processes for that, for the company at the time, how you communicate with product and design, like what were the processes that we use there. I think getting that all your ducks in a row for that was kind of really overwhelming, but it was really rewarding to work with people who gave advice on that and helped you like kind of find your bearings. And you know it ended up happening pretty quickly. So it's just something that happens in the beginning, and it makes sense because it's a brand new job in a brand new field, but it's definitely worth it.
Right. And like, what are any like technical like little tricks and tips that you learned when you first joined like Unitas? I know I showed you a few little like Git tricks and stuff like that, but
Yeah.
as someone that's kind of joining their first job, like what can they expect that like you kind of learned at Flatiron School, but maybe on the job it's like there's something completely different.
So that's a perfect example. I think Git. So at Flatiron, we did use it a little bit, but not as much. So I would recommend people that are like in Flatiron School to really work when you're working on those projects. Use Git to kind of push up to one project so that you're both like pushing up, and that'll help you kind of get that process going for when you actually start a job. So like what you showed me, like using like SCM breeze and figuring out like how to make things easier for you to keep track of all the branches that you have going on. Like those small, like things that seems something small like that, like really helps you organize yourself so that you can focus on things like, debugging or coding. Like if you can find tools like that to equip you and take, the work off of that, I think those things help, and really having a good setup as well.
Right. And did you ever have a case of like imposter syndrome or any pressure to feel like you need to perform? I know obviously every company is going to be a little bit different, but at least internally within yourself, how did you kind of deal with the stress of just a huge code base or just work in a work environment writing code?
Yeah, of course. I think especially like if you worked somewhere before where you had worked there for a long time, you're used to kind of producing right away and being that. But then going right into a company where you're now you're now the junior developer there. It's definitely you want to make sure that the work that you're putting up there is like perfect. And so you spend a lot of time looking at it, and then there's like that stress added to it. But I think what something that you had recommended early on where I started is like, just to kind of push it up there, get the feedback and really like, you know, not be afraid. You should be like, know that you kind of your work is good and what you put up there. And then, that's what code reviews are for. And that's why we're a team and kind of we work together. I think part of like, getting closer to your team and learning how to work with them is also something that really helps to de-stress and really make you feel more confident. And I think over the years, like that has really helped me to feel like I don't really feel that way anymore. And it's interesting how far you come from when you first start somewhere to afterwards, where you feel like, okay, yeah, I'm confident in this. Let me push it up and get feedback because I want this feedback.
Right. It's crazy because even you think that 3 months of coding bootcamp was crazy amounts of learning and things like that. But if anything, I say that first year of you having that job is like you exponentially learn even more from that experience, whether because you're around people that have been in the industry for such a long time. So they just kind of know like the little nuances of things like that. Like, is this performant or you shouldn't write your code like this because you might run into this problem. So getting that instant feedback from more experienced developers because man sometimes it's so hard to get help if you're just doing things by yourself
Yeah,
and being able to just communicate with your team and things like that is super important.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I learned to love code reviews for that. Like I look forward to the feedback from it to see like, oh, how can I improve? And I think having that mindset is going to help you do better and grow.
Yeah, and as you progressively get better, like the code reviews become less. There's just less comments and things like that. It just shows you that number one, like people trust you as your developer and your skills, and number two, you actually are just getting better as a developer. So these little mistakes that you were making before, it's just not happening as much, right? So
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah. So what are some things that you probably had some not misconception, but you probably had some thoughts about what a software developer is and what a software developer wasn't. But would you say a lot of your like what would you say are some things that are true about being a software developer and what are some things that are false? Like what are some ideas that you had about working as a software developer?
Yeah. Some things that are true, I had heard from various developers that they love, they really love their job and they love building and creating every day, and every day is solving a different problem. So you're never bored. And I definitely think like for me so far, that's been really true. It's like there's never kind of an end to learning. There's always more that you can learn and more that you can do to grow. So I definitely see that, and I agree. There's never a dull day. It's kind of a new puzzle that you're working on every day. And for things that were false about software development is that I thought there were only like initially, before boot camp and everything, I thought there were only like, one or two ways to become a software developer, but that's not like true at all. Like I've, met various like really talented and unique uh, developers that have come from different paths, whether it be self-study, whether it be through a computer science degree, whether it be, through a boot camp or, all sorts of other ways that have arrived there. And I think that's what makes, you know, this field like really interesting and like constantly evolving because it has people like that.
Oh, that's very true. That like there's just so many different ways you could learn how to code now. It's like I even in our like job right now, we've hired a lot of Flatiron School graduates, but I know one of them did the online route, and there are some of them are different cohorts. And, like I'm a different cohort technically, and
Yeah.
yeah, it's really cool to see that people make that transition into becoming a software developer for whatever reason. So, Sarah, yeah, if you had to give one piece of advice to an aspiring developer that is attending a bootcamp school or just going through that self-study route, what kind of advice would you give?
Yeah. I would definitely say like, don't give up. There are times where it feels really, really difficult, but you know, the, there's a light at the end of the tunnel and it's really rewarding. I would say right now there's a lot of like junior applicants and limited jobs, and it's important, to really like showcase your story and those transferable skills that you have from, whatever you did previously to, to really stand out. And I think that'll be really important. That'll be probably what that deciding factor is going to be.
Awesome, awesome. So for our new listeners, the TechRally Developer Spotlight will always end with a segment called Keeping It Real With. And today we're going to keep it real with Sarah. So Sarah, this is very similar to the last question I asked you about the advice, but what do you think is the biggest hurdle an aspiring developer needs to overcome to land that first job?
Yeah, I think that there are so many candidates, and that part about really standing out is important. I think another part of it is not giving up. So each interview that you have, using that as a learning experience, keeping track of where did this go wrong? What did I miss? Writing that down and doing your research and following up with it. And even like following up with that with that person, and like, sending a thank you, kind of keeping those lines of communication open for the future, because you never know if maybe you weren't the proper candidate at that time. But companies are always hiring, and you just never know what might happen. So I think it's just being diligent, and then keeping track of like what your interviews are looking like and where you can improve. I think that's going to help.
Right. Taking some ownership of your interview process, not just giving up, but taking notes and seeing how you can improve for next time is very good advice for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how I actually landed my first job. Like I didn't get the job. One of my classmates did. And I was super happy for him, obviously. And a month later, they called me back and they were like, hey, like we have a job for you. And then I just took that first job. So definitely following up and making sure, yeah, it's just keeping yourself accountable is super important. Sarah, just thank you so much for your time. For our listeners out there, is if they want to ask you any questions or contact you, where can they reach you?
Yeah, they can reach me at LinkedIn. That would be probably the best place. So Sarah Rivas Unitas, and you can find me on LinkedIn.
Yeah, and I'll add that in the description in the video. But yeah, so this is the end of the first episode of the TechRally Spotlight. And if you like content like this, hit that like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.